And we're back. Welcome back to Night City, and welcome back to Cyberpunk 2077, now at last updated with a true next-gen version of the game on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S. With the reveal of patch 1.50, your Cyberpunk install gets a 62GB upgrade on Xbox consoles, while PS5 owners get a separate app entirely, coming in at 56GB. The upshot? Well, developer CDPR promises a list of enhancements that are entirely unique to new consoles. As ever, the list of bug fixes is extensive in its patch notes, especially coming from our last test on patch 1.23, which will be the point of comparison today. But patch 1.50 crucially adds a new ray tracing mode on PS5 and Series X, enabling ray traced local shadows on console at 30fps, or if you prefer, there's also a 60fps performance mode. The new patch also promises frame rate and resolution improvements over previous patches, and lastly, it promises faster loading times. I've tested all these upgrades extensively against my last capture on 1.23, so is this the next-gen Cyberpunk upgrade we've been waiting for? Let's find out. Okay, to the basics. Booting the game, the biggest change you'll notice is on PS5 and Series X. Both consoles include two modes, one for ray tracing and another for performance. Performance mode promises to run at 60fps with a dynamic 4K resolution on both consoles. CDPR openly states on its spec sheet that small, rare frame rate drops might be on show, which is certainly true looking at frame rate results later on. More on that later. Next, there's the ray tracing mode, where for PS5 users, it's the first time a graphics mode toggle is offered, and as mentioned, you get local ray trace shadows, albeit with a 30fps cap and again a dynamic 4K picture. Xbox Series X gets the exact same options as PS5 in this sense, though the twist is the ray tracing mode replaces the quality mode previously used on Series X. You might recall quality mode gave us higher resolutions and settings with a similar 30fps cap, so this is a bit of a trade. On the surface then, it's a net win for PS5, bringing it on par with Series X in its core features. The dynamic 4K on both modes is a big win for image quality purists too, but as ever, the true resolution metrics rarely, if ever, amount to a genuine native 4K picture in gameplay. In fact, I've yet to see any scenario run at 4K. Let's run through what we actually get then, and how it actually improves on the older PS4 app before patch 1.50. First, here's PS5 running on performance mode. Patched to 1.50, this now runs at 2240 by 1260 lowest in the bustle of Night City, and at maximum it renders at 3072 by 1728 while looking, say, directly up at the sky. 1260p to 1728p is the range on PS5's performance mode then. For a 60fps targeting mode, it's a pretty respectable turnout, I think. It may not be 4K, but resolutions get a huge upgrade compared to the pre-patch results on PS5, which came in between 972p and 1200p while using the PS4 app. CDPR's optimization for new console hardware pays off hugely here. Plus, frame rates are boosted too, as we'll get to later. Switching over to Xbox Series X then, on its performance mode, we see a likewise upgrade. Pixel counts show the worst and best case. The lowest number comes in at 2458 by 1382 around the city centre, while the highest number tops out at 3168 by 1782 looking to the sky. Much like PS5, the range of resolutions here is an upgrade on the pre-patch results, which came in at between 1080p and 1296p in this case. The entire city appears sharper, cleaner, and again, this is the mode targeting 60fps. It's also worth noting Series X enjoys an overall lead in resolution over PS5 in the best and worst cases. But ultimately, with CDPR's temporal anti-aliasing, it's pretty hard to catch the difference. Still, in pure pixel metrics, the performance mode on patch 1.50 is a real surprise in just how much more it squeezes from PS5 and Series X. Next up, there's the ray tracing mode. The setup here is a little more straightforward. On PS5, the ray tracing mode runs at a native 1440p, and in fact, looking up to the sky, we'd expect to see the upper bounds. It's still rendering at 1440p rather than anything close to 4K. The plus side is, I've yet to spot any drops under that figure in the usual stress test points around the city. Xbox Series X follows the same pattern on its RT mode. Again, it's typically 2560 by 1440 no matter how we push the engine. Given this RT mode replaces the quality mode on Series X, which previously targeted a range of 1512p to 1728p, it's a pretty strange situation. Especially so given CDPR said this would dynamically target 4K. Either way, clearly 1440p is the trade-off to enable ray tracing features here, and for those after the highest resolution image, the performance mode is the better pick. Lastly, a word on Xbox Series S. There's no dressing this one up. Series S has no graphics toggle to speak on, and is set to simply run at a dynamic 1440p at 30 frames per second. In pixel counts, that's actually a range of between 2304 by 1296 up to 2560 by 1440 based on my testing. Purely on a surface level here, it's a shame to see it miss out on a 60fps mode, but equally, no ray tracing features are enabled either. So yes, for Series S users, there's less to be excited about. Still, the overall quality of life improvements on patch 1.50 do make Cyberpunk more playable for Series S. Just don't expect any revolutionary boosts to its visuals in this case. For that, we have to turn back to PS5 and Series X, where for the first time on console, ray trace shadows are enabled. I've mentioned ray tracing a lot, but what exactly is the ray tracing difference? I can say right away RT reflections are, sadly, not included at all on PS5 or Series X. All the focus is on improving shadows with a ray trace solution rather than anything else. And to be very frank, the impact it has varies hugely depending on where you look. So, here's a side-by-side on Series X showing performance and ray tracing modes. Series X in this case, a simple walk through Night City's market area doesn't make the upgrade very obvious between the modes. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to spot any difference between the two modes in overall visual quality. Even the resolution divide isn't too pronounced. Crowd density is randomized too, but appears to use a similar setting between both sides on PS5 and Series X. In some moments it'll appear one side has an advantage, but in broad strokes, the city is heavily populated regardless of mode. But back to the ray tracing, and for outdoors areas, the difference doesn't really stand out. But indoors is where the magic happens. Cyberpunk's early missions have some amazing moments to show RT shadows off. Ideally, you'll need to be indoors, as we've mentioned, with sharp directional lighting to really demonstrate the upgrade. Good news then that we can switch it on and off in the menus with no restart. In the Maelstromers HQ, for example, or earlier missions, see how ray tracing creates more diffused shadows. It follows real-world logic, where the further an object is from the light source, the more diffused the outline becomes. The same goes for vehicle barriers, small items around our apartment, even the pillows on our bed. The effect is often subtle, no question. In select spots though, shadows fully envelop a scene to create an obviously richer, deeper image. Note how in this shot medical equipment is now properly shaded. These are all locally ray traced shadows, and swapping from one to the other makes for a big difference. Now, from what I've seen, ambient occlusion in the ray tracing mode still relies on a screen space technique. Ray tracing is limited in this sense, affecting just select points in the scene, oftentimes in darkened interiors. And again, it's a shame to not see RT reflections included at all, though maybe expected given how taxing the setting is on PC. To make up for the lack of ray trace reflections, CDPR does at least improve the quality of screen space reflections, SSR, while in ray tracing mode. It's not quite what we were hoping for, obviously, but it's something. In rain-soaked environments, for example, you'll see reflections of neon signs become clearer in puddles below. Here's an example just outside the club. Switching between the two modes, the high SSR setting isn't a radical difference, but does add a slight refinement to clarity. Ray-traced local shadows and higher SSR quality are the two big upgrades then. Taking the ray tracing modes on PS5 and Series X into comparison, there's not much to split the two consoles otherwise. Even adding Series S into a three-way comparison, where all three target 1440p and 30fps, the ray tracing difference sticks out in select moments. Here again, we have an example just under the car ahead. Diffuse shade on PS5 and Series X at the same setting, and regular shadows on Series S. And likewise, looking at this chair in the Maelstromers HQ, shadows are again rendered at a higher quality for PS5 and Series X. Elsewhere, well, to be honest, the upgrade is less apparent. Textures, effects, draw distance on geometry, all are matched between the three in driving sequences. Reflections are improved on the two more powerful machines of course, but beyond that, it's a very similar presentation of Night City on each platform. Even crowd density on Series S, surprisingly, holds up next to the other two, especially around that market spot. On the whole, patch 1.50's big visual upgrade seems to mostly affect resolutions while in performance mode. It's a huge boost in pixel output compared to earlier patches, while the ray tracing mode improvements are respectable, if not the revolution I was hoping for. It's to Series S's credit that it still runs and looks as good as it does. In fairness, it's always held its own well as a 30fps experience, and it still does. Where PS5 and Series X really take a lead though, is in the ability to hit 60fps. So, let's take a look at the performance mode tests first, starting with PS5. Again, CDPR promises small, rare drops on the new patch, and the rarity point at least is true, though in my experience the drops where they do happen are pretty visible. So to test this, I've put together some side-by-side shots to show the optimization against patch 1.23. Now we have a true PS5 app on the right side with 1.50. There are a few points of interest just comparing patch 1.23 against 1.50 set to performance mode. It's impressive the game holds to 60fps as well as it does, given the new patch boosts the resolution range up to 1728p at peak. But there's another twist. The new PS5 app on 1.50 now uses a higher crowd density setting than patch 1.23. You'll see it all over the market, for example. It's bustling with NPCs, now fully populated much like Series X and S. For PS5, this is a big advantage for upgrading to the new version, and moving away from PS4 code. That being said, it's clear the system is being stressed harder as a result. Nothing comes for free, and perhaps as a consequence of the higher crowds, PS5 on the new patch drops its frame rate here more often than it did before. Around the marketplace at least, it amounts to a substantial drop into the high 40fps region, with occasional screen tearing, compared to the near locked 60fps on the older patch. Thankfully, this market area is a real outlier. Most scenes in Cyberpunk don't push PS5 nearly this hard. There are rarely major dips, and where they do appear, the results are often improved on 1.50 in most cases. In particular, driving is better optimized. You'll see drops on 1.23 that, well, are fixed on the new patch while hitting high speeds, avoiding the lurches into the 50s. Perhaps it's an improvement to the way quick asset streaming is handled. Either way, the net result is a smoother experience on the roads, and equally, during shootouts with the Maelstromers, drops are simply less apparent than before the patch. Indeed, stress testing the engine with our alley shootouts, one that brings enemy AI, physics, and a dense marketplace into view, has both patches drop hard. Even so, it's clear 1.50 drops less aggressively now. An occasional flash of screen tearing is introduced right at the top of the image, nearly impossible to catch by eye in play, but overall, running the newly updated PS5 app version of Cyberpunk is a smoother experience. Outside of the marketplace, frame rates are upgraded on PS5, if still not exactly perfect. Moving over to Series X next, we see an even bigger level of improvement. Actually, Series X had worse performance than PS5 overall on patch 1.23, mainly, I suspect, due to it targeting higher crowd density and a higher resolution. The need for optimization was much more urgent in this case, and so with patch 1.50 we have an answer, optimizing Series X's performance mode to create a huge change in some scenes. For starters, the opening car shootout is now completely fixed, locked at 60 FPS on the new update. Given it's running at a higher overall resolution range on the new patch, it's pretty much a win-win situation for image quality and playability here. And, likewise, emerging to Night City for the first time now doesn't drop quite as heavily into the high 40s, instead settling for around a 10 FPS improvement to pull it closer to the 60 FPS line. It's not perfect. Just like with PS5's latest update, screen tearing is introduced more liberally right at the top, but the margin of improvement in pure frames per second is without doubt satisfying for Series X. A few more tests on Series X. Driving through Night City shows a similar boost on the new patch to PS5. Exploring CDPR's world is less interrupted by these lurches, and likewise the shootouts in the Maelstrom's HQ fixes some of the huge drops into the low 40 FPS region we saw on patch 1.23. The latest patch solves a lot of these key stress points, and you're now reliably getting a solid 60 FPS line out of the game. A real highlight for me is the nightclub area, which used to waver up and down from 40 to 60 FPS, but now, just as with PS5, it's a 60 FPS lock on Series X. The only glaring spot, as ever, is the alley shootout test. Series X struggles here as you'd expect, and I'm not convinced there's all that much of an improvement. Still, the overall impression is good. Optimizations on patch 1.50 have paid off in a far better experience in the performance modes on each console. On the downside, and again, much like PS5, Series X's performance in the market run is lower than it was on the last patch, but this is really the only outstanding point and the rest is improved. So, as things stand, which console runs Cyberpunk best with a 60 FPS target? It's worth stressing both consoles are largely tied, locked to the 60 FPS line in almost every test, every scene. But if we're to push the engine hard to find the divide, PS5 is definitely the console that wins out every time. The market run, for example, and despite losing the locked 60 FPS it previously had, shows PS5 taking a lead over Series X by around 5 to 10 FPS. Both eventually level out at the same results once we get to the end of the run, where the screen is populated by NPCs on the last straight. But again, we see PS5 also with an advantage in driving past Tom's Diner, and even leading up to the alley shootout, there's a wide divide between the two. Sony's machine, fully updated, still beats Series X fully updated. But this isn't exactly representative of most of play. For the most part, you'll be seeing a 60 FPS line on both sides for shootouts, driving, and beyond. Ray tracing performance is next, and this is fairly straightforward. The ray tracing mode on PS5 runs at a practically perfect 30 FPS lock. Barring a very rare one-off frame hitch or rogue tear at the top of the screen, this is extremely consistent from my testing on PS5. And so it goes on Series X. There are flashes of a drop in shootouts, but these are so fleeting. The only real issue with this mode, something my colleague John Lindemann and I both experienced, is the general input latency with the game using a 30 FPS cap. It can make it harder to aim, to drive, and generally navigate the world, but as far as frame rate delivery goes, it does exactly what it sets out to do on both consoles. If ray trace shadows at 1440p is what you want, this is the mode for you. Xbox Series S, meanwhile, if we move over to that, follows a similar pattern if we move over to its one default mode. We get a dynamic 1440p, no ray tracing, and a near perfect 30 FPS cap again, only occasionally blighted by frame rate hitches. A final test on loading times. The good news is the PS5 app on 1.50 is much better optimized to take advantage of its SSD bandwidth now. It drastically improves loading times over the last patch in reloading your last checkpoint or save. In this case, I'm loading a save in the alley area ahead of the market. The new patch on PS5 gets us there in just 13 seconds, while previously we had to wait a whole 44 seconds to get to the same point. A huge saving, no question, and it's especially pronounced for PS5 users, where the PS4 app always had slow loading times next to the Xbox Series S and X. Now, tested together on patch 1.50, PS5 achieves a similar loading speed to Series X in this spot, falling just shy of the 12-second result on Xbox. This is a huge boost for the game's playability on PS5 especially, the only real shame being it didn't arrive sooner. Overall then, Cyberpunk's latest next-gen patch, 1.50, benefits PS5 and Series X in myriad ways. For PS5, it all at once makes performance mode run at a higher resolution, a higher frame rate, and with a heftier NPC count. Loading times are substantially improved on PS5 as well, and while there are some added frame rate drops around market areas, it's broadly speaking an improved experience elsewhere. Even DualSense features make the cut here, added in the form of tension to the adaptive triggers, which may appeal to some. Plus, PS5 now enjoys a graphics mode toggle to add ray tracing, something we'd never seen before on the console. As for Series X, well, many of the improvements in crowd density and loading times were already in place before patch 1.50 on the older code path. Instead, the reason to celebrate Series X this time is in the way it now pushes higher resolutions and improves its sub 60 FPS performance mode with a much tighter lock at 60. The frame rate upgrade alone speaks for itself. Disappointments. Yes, there are a few. Patch 1.50 adds ray tracing, sure enough, but its impact isn't as widespread as I'd hoped. Rarely do the RT shadows stand out, whereas ray trace reflections might have represented a more visible so-called next-gen difference. It would have made a statement of the game's progress on console. Also, and I hate to say it, but Series S feels especially underserved on this next-gen patch. It's missing key features, 60 FPS and ray tracing, from the other two machines. As a baseline experience at 30 FPS, it's still robust as it always was, but it lacks any frills. All consoles at least enjoy quality of life upgrades. The gameplay is rebalanced, there's also long-awaited character customization options and plenty more. But I'd be hard-pressed to call this the dream generational leap that Cyberpunk players have been waiting for. To my mind, Cyberpunk's latest patch at least does one great thing. It creates a more stable base to build on for future updates and patches. The bug fixes are plenty, and CDPR is slowly chiseling away at its work to define it, to remove its blemishes. I've experienced no crashes, no soft locks, which is a start. Performance has never been better, and at least PS5 and Series X are standardized in their options, their ray trace shadows, and crowd density. Beyond this, well, we'll have to wait on more patches. For now, Cyberpunk is arguably in the position it should have been at launch well over a year ago. For those tempted to replay the game to see its next-gen features, there's really no show-stopping moment. But for newcomers, there's never been a better time to experience the game on console. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this analysis, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.